applicants. Third, we will explore why identifying the student's academic direction is so important in this process. And fourth, we will investigate exactly what the top schools in the country actually want. And a hint, its contribution, and we're going to talk about that in more detail shortly. Before we jump into college admissions, I want to take a moment to describe why I believe I'm one of the more qualified people in the United States to talk about college admissions. I've served as a senior admissions officer at 3 different US universities. I've personally been responsible for over 30,000 applications for admission. I was asked by the University of Pennsylvania's Dean of Admissions to review their application review criteria before they rolled it out to their admissions readers. I was fortunate that in my role as Director of Admissions at Cornell University's College of Arts and Sciences, I had the opportunity to play host to the Ivy Plus conference in Ithaca, New York. For those of you who do not know what the Ivy Plus group is, it is every Ivy League school, plus Stanford, MIT, and Duke. Every 2 years, the deans and directors from every single one of those schools gets together for an Ivy Plus enrollment summit where we discuss everything related to college admissions. Of course, that provided invaluable insight into literally most of all the selective schools in the country. And finally, when I was appointed the Director of Admissions, I was 32 years old, by far the youngest in the Ivy League. I've managed a process of over 20,000 applications for admission each year at Cornell. I supervised a staff comprised of PhD level faculty, and I hired and trained over 40 application readers per year. The reason I share this experience is that I want you to know that my perspective is grounded in actual experience. I'm not guessing, I've been there. That said, we're going to cover some tough topics today as it relates to how being Asian impacts being an applicant at highly selective colleges and universities. Please know I'm bringing forward data and information to illustrate real challenges. I believe that if we know the challenge, we will be better prepared to successfully meet that challenge. Finally, I truly want this presentation to provide real actionable ideas about how to give yourself the absolute best chance of earning an offer of admission. But for real, folks, if you want to do this right, you have to understand how colleges and universities work and how that impacts the way they make decisions. For people unfamiliar with this topic, it can be complex. This presentation was originally subtitled Turning Obstacles into Opportunities. You may have noticed that on the opening slide, I retitled it, A Master's Class in College Admissions, because that's kind of what this is. I think you will find that almost no other consultants share this type of information. They hold back information because they don't want to run out of suggestions. I am holding nothing back. I want you to know the plan. I want you to know how to implement that plan. If I have clients in the audience this evening, I'm very confident that no matter how many questions I answer, our clients still have a significant advantage because plans and stories are personal. As they say, the devil is in the details. It's all about implementation. Since time is limited, sometimes I do not provide a topic as much depth as it might deserve. If I move too quickly over a certain aspect, please jot down your question and I will try to answer it during the Q&A. Okay, let's get started. Part 1, is there a bias against Asian students? We often hear about quotas, but I would argue that it is impossible to determine if a quota actually exists. Universities know that quotas are not legal as such. They don't have quotas. They have what they refer to as a general awareness about how many of each cohort, right? Cohort being just a fancy name for a smaller group of similar students, like Asian students or pre-med students. They have a general awareness of how many of each cohort were taken last year. I think we need to shift the conversation away from quotas, which as noted are literally impossible to prove, toward an inherent reader bias. A quick glance at the chart illustrates that a significant majority of the American public have negative views of China. And I think that we see this unfortunate fact manifested in the way admissions officers read Asian applications for admission. This chart was taken directly from the lawsuit against Harvard, which claimed that Harvard discriminated against Asian applicants. And what we find from the most selective school in the country is that Asian applicants earn the lowest scores by a rather large margin in the personal ratings category. But well before this chart was made public, I observed this unfortunate fact throughout my career in highly selective college admissions. Again, this specific data was taken directly from the Harvard lawsuit. So let's take a moment to examine it in a bit more depth. What does it mean when you actually break it down? If we only used grades and test scores, including AP scores, Asian students would represent 43% of the incoming class at Harvard, represented by Model 1 under the academics only column. When we throw in extracurricular and personal aspects, that percentage of the class drops to 26%, represented by Model 3 under the extracurricular and personal column. That means that 17% of the spaces at Harvard are lost because the applicant failed to demonstrate desirable personal qualities through thoughtfully conceived extracurricular activities. This has nothing to do with the fact that the applicant is Asian. As you may notice, I'm not even mentioning Model 4, which takes demographics of being Asian into account. I'm focused on the 17%, the difference between the 43% noted in Model 1 column and the 26% noted in Model 3 column. This 17% represents students who should have been admitted based on academic ability, had they demonstrated desirable personal qualities through thoughtfully conceived extracurricular activities. As noted, this is straight from the data at Harvard, and I can confirm I've witnessed this throughout my 10+ years in college admissions. Asian students often focus their application on qualities and engagement experiences that are not valued at top-tier US universities. This is our mountain, right? This is our challenge. Okay, now that we understand the challenge, we will move on to part 2 of the presentation, the review process. But before we jump into how to build an application, I want to take a moment to speak broadly about some of the very common mistakes I see amongst Asian applicants. I've broken them into 2 categories. They are the qualities Asian applicants focus on and the way Asian applicants spend their time and their energy. Take note of the 3 qualities listed on the left-hand side of the slide: hard work, dedication, and organization. Elite universities do not want students who are quote unquote working hard. They want students who barely notice that they're working hard because they're having so much fun exploring. Dedication and organization, these are qualities that can be inferred from the output of the success. If the student is successful, the college admissions office will assume he or she is dedicated or organized enough to be successful. The admissions offices want to know about qualities like curiosity, exploration, and contribution. They want to know that students are interested enough about the world around them to actually ask some questions. They want to know that the students are motivated enough to actually get up and explore those questions. And they want to know that the potential applicants seek to make some level of contribution to the community through those endeavors. Parents, remember this because you will be asked to complete brag sheets, identifying the qualities that represent your children for the teachers and the guidance counselors who will serve as recommenders. And many of the teachers and counselors will literally use exactly what is provided on that document. Brag sheets are a huge opportunity to provide the application direction and focus on the qualities that are valued. Don't miss that opportunity. Next, we will look at time and energy. What we find is that Asian students often spend a lot of time in things like musical engagement, athletic engagement, artistic engagement, or traditional volunteerism, like working at a soup kitchen or a retirement home. To be clear, in 99% of instances, regardless of what you have heard or seen elsewhere, these things will not have a major impact on admissions decisions. Unless the student plans to be a music major, play a sport, or be an art major, those activities have almost no impact on decision making. Does that mean they're bad? No, of course not. Some of those activities may enhance your ability to be successful in other really important areas, but the engagement itself is likely to have little or no impact on an admissions decision. I always ask my clients, do you love it? If you love it, regardless of whether it helps you get into college, you should do it. But if you don't love it, and it's not furthering your goal of getting to the types of universities you're looking for, then you may at least want to consider how much time and energy is being invested. I want to start the application review section by discussing the aspects of the application that really impact decision-making. I want to walk through the different parts of the application and point out areas where I typically see mostly Asian students negatively impacted in the review process. First, the standardized test. This is always the first thing people think about as it relates to why it is harder for Asian students. And it's true. Asian students score higher than every other ethnicity on the SAT and the ACT. Thus, Asian students with test scores below the top 50% of whatever school they're applying to very likely will be filtered out of the review process and thus rejected. Moving from standardized tests to curriculum, what we find as it relates to unsupported curriculum is that Asian students applying to humanities or social science majors, and they apply to those areas often because they think it's easier to get in. And in some instances, it is easier to get in. But what we find is they're applying to those majors with elective courses in STEM areas. That inconsistency in the application will very likely lead to a rejection. Then we move on to academic rigor, right? Did the student challenge themselves in high school as it relates to their curriculum? And what we find with Asian students is oftentimes, if they're interested in clear STEM areas, which many Asian students are, and they apply to an area like computer science or engineering, they may be applying with what is a reasonable math sequence, but it's not the top math sequence at their high school. So for example, they're in Calc AB, maybe even Calc BC as a senior, but the high school is offering multivariable or differential equations. And if other Asian students from your high school are in those courses, which oftentimes they are, that can lead to a rejection. Then we move to in-school extracurricular activities. In many instances, I find Asian students may ignore these activities altogether, or they say that they want to study history, again, maybe because they like history or they think it might be a little bit easier to get in, but they're part of the computer science coding club or they're part of the robotics club. If you want to identify yourself as a history major and you're in the computer science coding club and the robotics club, that very likely would end up in a rejection. Then we move to out-of-school extracurricular activities. What we find is that Asian students often fail to develop a consistent theme amongst your out-of-school extracurricular activities. These out-of-school extracurricular activities are important to illustrate progress and building upon experiences from in-school, maybe even from out of school. They're building blocks. And we need to illustrate growth and progression through out-of-school extracurricular activities. A lot of times, there's a lot of scattered engagement for our Asian students, and so that inconsistency likely can lead to a rejection. And then we think about outside of school programs and courses, right? These are your college courses, your summer programs. And what I find is that Asian students oftentimes will focus on finding what they consider to be high prestige programs. Penn comes to mind because a lot of students seem to be interested in the Penn summer programs. And I think the reason the students are interested in the high prestige summer programs is that they believe that if they apply to a school that maybe is a little less selective than, say, Penn, where they went for their summer program, that the admissions office will read it and say, wow, look, they went to Penn during the summer. The student must be quite impressive. And that's just really not the way it functionally works. Most summer programs are revenue generators, right? They're built to generate revenue for the college or university, even the selective ones. And so I would argue that prestigious summer programs or courses are really not very important. What's important is that the summer program or course clearly connects to the area of academic interest the students identifying when they're applying to college. And oftentimes I'll see Asian students kind of forego a less select or a very clear connective program that might be a little less selective for a more prestigious program that clearly doesn't really connect to what they want to do. And then the last part is research and community exploration, where what I find is that Asian students may engage in what they refer to as accessible research opportunities, right? So if I start to reach out to a bunch of faculty members and only certain ones respond to me, well, then that's the accessible research opportunity, and that gets thrown into the application as part of the story. But that research project, that research question needs to be very clearly connected to the area of academic interest noted in the application. If not, that inconsistency, again, will likely lead to a rejection. Okay, assuming all of the previously noted areas of the application, the kind of the pieces I just went through are, I'll use the term fine, right? They're okay, meaning all of the subtle differences are understood and considered, and there are no red flags. Then we get to the actual admission selection committee conversations. Does that make sense? All of the other stuff, the rigor, the appropriate curriculum, the SATs, the appropriate extracurriculars, those are bars of entry. Applicants generally must have these things to even be considered. After that is when the decisions hang in the balance. If we want to know how to get into the best schools in the country, we simply need to look at what they're asking of their applicants. So what are the top 50 schools asking about? Almost every highly selective college asks the same thing. They fundamentally, when you submit one application, right? When you submit an application to a college, you may submit one application with one essay. That's your common application personal statement. But most of the top 50 schools are asking for supplemental essay responses. And it's very helpful to look ahead to find out what you will need to respond to in the future. And as I noted, what we find is they're all asking basically the same thing. They're asking, what do you want to study? Why do you want to study it? How have you explored it? And what might you contribute to this space at this particular college or university? If you look at the example questions noted on the slide, what academic areas most pique your curiosity? And how do the programs at Princeton suit your particular interests? What field of study at MIT appeals to you? And why does this field appeal to you? How did you discover your intellectual and academic interests, and how will you explore them at Penn? As noted in the upper portion of the slide, they may phrase them a bit differently. Some of them are phrased as explain your academic interest questions. Some of them are explain why the school questions. Some of them are the what do you hope to accomplish using this education question. But fundamentally, they're all asking the same thing. They want to know what you want to study. They want to know how you explored it. And they want to know why you need this specific experience in order to further that exploration. For most young students, one of the hardest parts is simply identifying what they may be interested in. In my experience, it all starts with making students aware of what's happening in the world around them and how that may connect to areas of academia. For example, I run into students daily that are interested in Bitcoin. Now, is Bitcoin a major in college? Certainly not. But what would an exploration into Bitcoin look like? Well, Bitcoin is an example of what we refer to as decentralized finance. And if we were to explore decentralized finance, what we would find is decentralized finance would connect to academic majors at the collegiate level, like finance, economics, computer science, data and information science, even behavioral psychology, government, public policy, sociology, and international relations. If the student's not interested, after going through that conversation, we move on. If the student is intrigued, we move forward with directional ideas about how to start exploration. For example, we may suggest a summer program to provide more insight into whether the student's interest is in finance or in economics before identifying additional engagement ideas. Once the student has explored enough to identify that this general area, let's just say general finance, for example, once they've explored enough to identify that this general area is where he or she would like to spend their time and their energy exploring, it's time to start to investigate our end goals. We want to explore the prospective majors so that we have an understanding of the most strategic path to that end. Remember, in most cases, we will need to identify a prospective major to build the most competitive application for admission. But first, before we discuss how to consider the right prospective majors, it's important to note the distinction between a college and a university. At a university, there are often multiple colleges. Cornell, for example, has 7 different colleges. I tell you this because as we move forward, we will be talking about the importance of identifying the college at the university that the student plans to apply to, meaning that there is a strategy and there are consequences behind choosing one college over another at the same university. For example, in most instances, it's much harder to earn an offer from the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell than the College of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell. Just like it's much harder to get into NYU Stern than it is to get into NYU Arts and Sciences. Each college at the same university will have different levels of competitiveness and transferability. And since the major exists in the college, the prospective major choice impacts competitiveness of getting in and even the transferability once you get there. Let me give you an example. A student wants to apply to NYU Stern because she wants to study finance. But she learns that it's harder to get into NYU Stern than it is to get into NYU Arts and Sciences. So she wants to consider applying to NYU Arts and Sciences and then transferring. We call this an internal transfer, meaning if you go from one college at NYU to another college at NYU, we refer to that as an internal transfer because it's internal to the university. So she's thinking about an internal transfer from Arts and Sciences to Stern once she's been accepted, using the easier route to the university, going the Arts and Sciences direction. Is this a good idea? No, it's very unlikely that she's going to be able to transfer from Stern to Arts and Sciences, as they take very few external or internal transfers. Thus, if you want to study in a real business program, this strategy would not make sense because she is likely to be locked out of a business college. Let me give you another example. A student wants to apply to NYU Arts and Sciences to study computer science, but she learns it is harder to get into NYU as a prospective computer science major than it is applying as a prospective sociology major. So she wants to consider focusing her application on her social science-centered experiences to get in, then declare computer science as her major. Is this a good idea? Probably yes. Of course, assuming she has sufficient social science-related experience and she puts that experience together in the right way without letting the university know she's actually interested in computer science. This would, in fact, be a strategic way to apply because sociology and computer science would be in the same College of Arts and Sciences. So identifying sociology at the outset and then going to computer science is not a problem. They exist in the same college. The 2 points I'm trying to make, and I know I'm hammering it home here, but it's so important. First, transferring amongst colleges at the same university, as noted, NYU in Arts and Sciences to NYU Stern, is not guaranteed and in some instances very unlikely. The second point, changing majors within the same college, as noted, sociology to computer science, that is very easy and very likely. Thus, when we are considering a prospective major, we need to consider two things. We want to make sure that we've identified the appropriate college so that the student has access to the major he or she ultimately wants, right? We don't want them stuck in a college that doesn't offer the major they want and they are not unable to transfer to the college they actually want. But assuming, part two, that we have in fact identified the correct college, we want to consider the competitiveness of the prospective major. For example, computer science and pre-med are super hard compared to, say, a more social science focused area. If this all seems a bit too complicated, rest easy, at least initially. There are really only three typical paths to choose from. They are business, which encompasses things like accounting, economics, finance, management, and marketing. Then second one is engineering, things like bioengineering, civil engineering, electrical engineering, material science. And then arts and sciences, which is basically everything else. If you hope to apply as a prospective engineering or prospective business student, it is advised you make that decision very early. Since both colleges are rather specific, many of the best applicants will have very specific interests that translate to deep academic stories of investigation in these spaces. If we are being practical, evidence must be built before, say, 11th grade for a student to have a legitimate chance at elite schools in these specific areas. Since arts and sciences is by far the most broad college, I will focus much of the rest of this presentation on the college that offers everything from economics and computer science to biology, Greek literature, and the classics. So generally, within the College of Arts and Sciences, there are three main directions or three main areas from which to consider. And I've noted them on this slide in order of competition or bar of entry. The three areas are STEM, and as you'll note, there's a special note for the ultra high competitiveness of pre-med or computer science focused STEM students. The second one, the medium bar of entry, is your social sciences. And the third area, the lowest academic bar of entry, are your humanities. And under the requirements, you will note there are 4 elements of the application. They are motivation. An example of motivation would be, I took a course in Python over the summer, and that got me really interested in computer science. The second one is engagement. An example of engagement would be, I'm the founder of the encryption club at my high school. After I took that summer program, I became interested in computer science. I find encryption fascinating, so I was the founder of the encryption club. The third one is depth, right? So now I've started to explore computer science. Maybe the student is engaged in a research project that focuses on neomorphic computing structures, right? Now we've created a subsection under computer science that this student's interested in the computing structure, neomorphic computing structure, so we've created depth. And then the final one is objective achievement, right? So this would be like second place at Regeneron Science Fair. So please note that the asterisk next to the objective achievement and the coinciding asterisk next to pre-med and computer science, this indicates that for those areas at highly selective schools, objective achievement might be quite important. In less selective programs or at less selective universities, earning an offer may only require 3 or even 2 of the noted elements or requirements on this slide. Okay, guys, we're getting to the super important part of the presentation. If you're getting tired and you're dozing off, try to wake up for this slide. Academic fit is literally what this is all about. When people think about college admissions officers, they seem to think about them as gatekeepers. And in many instances, they act as gatekeepers. But up to 50% of many admissions officers' jobs is recruitment. The number one thing that people applying to highly selective colleges want to know about are the majors, right? Of course, they want to know about the programs they're going to apply to. And once a curious student decides he or she wants to study, say, particle physics, for example, the first thing those students do is learn more about the physics department. They want to know things like, will I have access to a particle accelerator? So in order to effectively recruit top-tier academic students, admissions officers must be versed in the unique qualities of the academic departments. And since the faculty know that it is in fact the admissions officer's job to recruit the best students for their departments, they meet with the admissions offices every single summer. Like the summers are spent faculty meeting with admissions officers. And the reason they do that is because admissions officers are expected to understand the slight differences between, relatively similar academic programs. And you see the quote on the slide. I remember this from one of my experiences. One of the faculty members said, basically, the reason we're meeting with you is so that you can do a better job of explaining to prospective students the amazing things our faculty are doing in these departments. And what happens is that translates that conversation between a faculty member and the admissions officer about their specific department, that translates into a hyper-focus on academic fit, especially for your underserved academic departments. The admissions officers remember those conversations, right? They happen every year. And when they read the applications, they're looking to see, is this student going to provide what the faculty member indicated is what this department is all about? The applicant's job is to illustrate through the academic and extracurricular engagement that they are uniquely qualified to make a likely contribution to that specific academic department. If we can assume for a moment that the applicant has successfully identified an area of legitimate interest, we might want to peek ahead to get some ideas about how we can build an application that will illustrate exactly the focus and qualities that are valued. For the parents in the audience, imagine you are applying for a job. The first thing you do is review the position description. You do this so that you can understand the position needs and identify your experiences that provide evidence that you can meet those needs. It would be very difficult to position yourself well for that job if you never looked at the position description or never had an understanding of what the position demanded. In this instance, we're basically doing the same thing, but instead of applying for a job, we're applying to college. And instead of reviewing a position description, we're reviewing the academic departments the student may apply to in the future. For example, if you were working with me or my team and you noted your interest in, say, government or public policy, we would review those programs at a wide variety of schools to get a sense of the different focuses at the different departments. And we might eventually land on a more unique option, like, say, the School of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell, which dives into things like how policy impacts the workforce. In this case, we would first take a look at the types of questions we might have to answer in the future, right? So those are your supplemental essay questions. And as noted, they're pretty much all asking the same thing. What do you want to study? Why do you want to study it? And how have you explored it? Next, we would want to try to explore the why do you want to study it here aspect of the question. And what we want to do in order to do that is we want to identify the key aspects of the college. In this case, it's work, employment, and labor. You would be amazed how many very smart, intelligent students develop very poor applications to ILR specifically, this college, because they never really orient themselves with what the school is actually all about. Then we try to understand how the students and the faculty in the programs are actually learning more about the area, meaning we want to understand what types of faculty, courses, research, organizations, etc. exists to help the faculty members and the students develop a better understanding of the area of academia. And finally, we want to develop a plan that provides for multiple opportunities throughout high school to spend time and energy engaging in activities that serve as evidence of logical investigation into that area of academia. Back to the parents for a moment. It's like peeking at the position description of the job you want and then making sure you volunteer for all of the assignments that would prepare you to fit the needs of that position. Okay, once we've identified an area of academic interest and we've identified the types of departments we will eventually be trying to make the case that we can contribute to, we are ready to begin building our evidence. First, we need to build the engagement foundation. This is very important. Even if you think your high school has really terrible clubs and organizations, or you feel that you have way more exciting things to do outside of school, you still need to be in at least a few in-school clubs and organizations. This is considered foundational engagement. Schools want to know whether you will take advantage of the resources that are in front of you. And the only way we know that is if we see you take advantage of the resources available to you in your high school. And some of those resources are clubs and organizations. If for some reason you feel that those clubs and organizations really are of not much value, then I would argue that part of your job is to help improve those clubs and organizations so that you can make a long-lasting impact on that community. After that, it's all about building and layering experiences. Let me give you an example of layering experiences. For this example, we'll assume that the student's interested in political science or public policy. At first, the student might get involved in, say, student government at their high school, foundational engagement. And then they might engage in a government program in Washington, D.C. during the summer. Since the student is in fact a student, right, in the educational system, maybe they became interested in the public policy behind the public school system. And in an effort to learn more, the student decides to explore, and I had a student do this last year, the efficacy of the remedial summer programs in his or her local school district. Those findings could then be presented at a local school board meeting. Then the student might engage in a faculty mentor-led research project that compares and contrasts the best and worst practices of remedial programs in his or her state. Those findings could be published in a local newspaper or in an academic journal. This student has connected the experiences, created layered depth by exploring through a variety of platforms, and illustrated the ability to consider questions from an academic and community application-based perspective. The benefit of this type of evidence building is that it will serve as the foundation of your academic narrative. And it will highlight the qualities of curiosity, self-motivation, independence, creativity, problem solving, persistence, etc. These qualities, demonstrated through varied exploration of an area of interest, these qualities will help you earn offers of admission. Okay. The student has built the foundation of engagement by joining clubs and doing things outside of school. The student has created depth by developing a research topic. Let's now fast forward to the application time. Why are we doing all of this? The first thing we do, my team does with every single client, is we engage in an academic narrative review. An academic narrative is essentially all of the things the student has done that supports their application direction. I believe this is absolutely essential. And as you can see, we start in 9th grade and we identify the motivations and focuses of each experience to build the overall application direction. Each part of the journey provides an element of the application story. Our job is to identify all of our possible evidence pieces so that we can use our content in the best way possible. For example, in this slide noted, Susie Q volunteered at the Nehemiah Center in 9th grade, highlighted in blue. And since this center works with underprivileged kids, it fits the academic narrative that this student is telling. So it gets added to this specific academic narrative. What we then do is we connect each experience to the next experience so that we understand how the student explored the area of interest across a variety of time and different experiences. Then we go through the exercise of identifying what I refer to as associated words, as highlighted in blue on the slide. In this instance, we note this specific experience connects to words like education, policy, equity, charitable foundations. We will use these words and the associated experiences later to connect to the words we find when we engage in the exploration of the specific academic departments. Once we have built our evidence, created our academic narrative, we are ready to begin the application process. If the student has been thinking about this stuff for a while now, they probably should know exactly what programs they are applying to well before it's time to apply. If the student has not been thinking about this in advance, it is important that they consider the universe of possible academic fits through the review of the academic narrative that we just mentioned. For example, imagine the student wants to go to medical school and thus wants to apply pre-med. Side note, this is a very bad idea. You never note pre-med on your application, but that is a story for another day. We can talk about that later. Nonetheless, as an interested pre-med student, the student decides they're interested in Cornell University. Which college at Cornell might fit for someone who wants to follow the pre-med path? Well, there are literally 3 separate colleges, all with their own culture and focus that could offer the path to medical school, including Arts and Sciences, the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, and the College of Human Ecology. If we focus only on the College of Arts and Sciences for just a moment, there are 6 different prospective majors for the pre-med health-focused applicant in the College of Arts and Sciences alone. If you add in the other 2 colleges, the options for a pre-med student can be overwhelming. Further, each program has differing competitiveness, so choosing the wrong one does have consequences. And this is only one university. If a student is applying to 5 or 10 universities, there can be a large variety of possibilities to strategically consider. So how do you actually know how to decide the right or the most strategic prospective major path for the application? My team engages in what I refer to as prospective major research. If you recall Susie Q from the academic narrative, we're now going to take that same academic narrative and we're going to ask ourselves, how will the evidence of this narrative illustrate how I can contribute to one of the majors or one of the minors at this specific college? In the example above, we've identified at least 5 different programs that Susie Q could provide evidence for. Each program is evaluated, and we consider whether each option could benefit the student's application story or overall application competitiveness. After a thorough review, one or multiple programs are selected as providing the best combination of strategic advantage and the student's future goals. Okay, guys, we're finally here. This is literally all for this, the supplemental essay. This is the question or questions that the dean or director literally wrote themselves, specifically hoping to evoke a response that provides insight into whether this applicant will contribute something of value to this community. But you are ready for this moment because you have already prepared your academic narrative. You have all the details necessary for a deep and specific academic narrative that translates into a deep and specific academic application for college. You've identified your end goal, right? Meaning you've already engaged in your prospective major research, and you've identified and focused on the activity and the departments that provide the best match, meaning your experiences and the opportunities at the institution, you've identified those. With those essential pieces of information, you're ready to build an awesome supplemental essay. So how do we begin to prepare for the most important part of this application? The steps are as follows. Number one, review your academic narrative. All of the things that you did that are commonly connected from ninth to now, be familiar with it. Part two, review the universe of possible academic departments based on your academic narrative, right? You're saying, here's all the things I did, here are all the different majors that I could possibly apply to and illustrate that I've explored in some way. And then part three, identify the best matches between your experiences and the academic departments. That's literally it. All of the work that you did to this moment is to prepare you for these types of essays so that you can use your varied and deep experiences to tell the school what you will add to their academic community. As a side note, in my experience, some of you might be wondering, can't you just apply as an undecided student? Why do I even have to identify this prospective major? Real quick, there are two different types of undecided students. The desirable undecided student sounds something like this. I love space. One of the things I'm fascinated by is whether life can be sustained in space. To that end, I'm engaging in a research project that would explore whether the mRNA vaccine would be effective in space. In order to answer questions like this, I feel the need to have an understanding of chemical engineering, biomedical engineering, and aerospace engineering. Most of my project work integrates some aspects of these areas, but at this time, I'm undecided which of those areas will be my focus. This type of undecided student can be a highly sought after applicant, but this is sometimes a more complex route. I always suggest we build one academic foundation to start, and then we consider the interdisciplinary narrative opportunities. The second type of undecided student sounds something like this, and this is significantly more common. I like STEM-related stuff. My grades are pretty good in STEM areas. Math comes easy to me, and science is cool. My parents want me to be a doctor, but I don't know. I'll probably do something in STEM. I'm not saying that's what they write in their essays, but fundamentally, that's what's going on in their heads. And these students, even with very strong grades and test scores, these students are often waitlisted. The following is an example of what we are trying to accomplish. In the end, we are trying to illustrate that the applicant's experience provides both context for academic interest and a likelihood of future contribution in this academic space. So I'm going to read this and note what is important about each part of this sample paragraph. Of course, I'm pretending to be the applicant as I write this, and the details of this paragraph, just to be clear, are incorrect. They were changed purposefully, so it would not be smart to just kind of copy this, but it makes the point. In 2020, I wrote an article entitled X that explored the funding gap between white and non-white school districts in X district. So as the applicant, in one sentence, I've immediately identified the experience I have that I want to connect to the institution. In the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Pennsylvania, I hope to take Dr. Jamila Meichner's course titled Politics of Public Policy in the United States to learn more about how to navigate the sociological and economic complexities in making changes to educational policy. Now, it's important to note that we did identify a course, right? Politics of Public Policy in the United States. But the verbiage that comes after that course to learn more about how to navigate, that is from the course description, but certainly it's not copy and pasted from this course description, right? You need to interpret the course description in order to connect it to your experience. Moving on, Dr. Meichner's 2018 article entitled Gentrification of whatever that was opened my eyes to the cultural sensitivities behind equity and access through her XYZ analysis. Now, what's important about this sentence? Imagine there's no way you could possibly write that sentence if you had not read her article, because you would not be able to identify what opened your eyes to the cultural sensitivities as it relates to her analysis, right? So you can't just take research and throw it into a supplemental essay. You need to be aware of what the research is about and be able to connect that back to your own experience. After engaging in a variety of investigative journalism experiences in high school, right? So this student had written a bunch of articles. And as you see, I wrote links in the application because you would want to provide that evidence. I hope to explore the paradoxes of policymaking issues in more depth at Penn. I hope to contribute to the Crime, Prison, Education, and Justice Program, NCAS. And here's by far the most important part of this paragraph. by further expanding on Dr. Meichner's exploration into the unwanted synergies between crime and education. The key part of this is that we've illustrated a future forward-looking perspective of how the student might contribute, might expand, might progress on the work that's being done at the college already. Now, of course, in a real paragraph, in a real supplemental essay, we would expand on that. We wouldn't just kind of jump around, but the paragraph makes the point. We're trying to connect student experience to the opportunity. And when I say opportunity, to be clear, that's what this is, right? The colleges are not, you're not getting something from them. At least that's not the way you should discuss it in your application. The colleges and universities are providing you an opportunity, right? And your experience provides you the foundation you need to take advantage of that opportunity. And the opportunity is to contribute to a really exciting, dynamic community. In the end, and I know most of you already know this, good grades and good test scores just are not enough. This is the result of not having a plan. Bright but standard, familiar profile. You know, this student right here in this specific graphic very easily could have 1,600 and perfect scores in the most rigorous curriculum. It still would be bright but standard, familiar profile, because we're not identifying how the student is going to be contributing to this specific community. As noted, there are in fact spaces to be won at the top colleges based on academic ability, right? At Harvard, we know that 17% of the spaces are being lost because we have not identified extracurricular activities that illustrate the personal qualities that are valued. Our job is to give the admissions officers the non-standard, the unfamiliar, the depth, the specific. With a clear strategy and plan, in all honesty, it really isn't as hard as you might think. Before we finish up and I take questions, I want to take a moment to provide a bit of insight into our process and into our work. First, the plan. I know it says 7th through 11th. Of course, I really believe starting early is fundamentally important here. Why is that? Just imagine for a moment you have two students, they're exactly the same academically, same test scores, same grades, same ability. One student decided in 11th grade what he or she wanted to do at the collegiate level. One student decided in 9th grade. It would be almost impossible for the 11th grader to build as much evidence as the 9th grader. That doesn't mean that all 9th graders, as you noted, I have 7th grade, right? That doesn't mean everyone's ready. But in the end, starting to have these conversations about why making some choices, not life-defining choices, but choices about the way you apply to college earlier rather than later, having those conversations is really important. And starting earlier, from what I have found, is the best way to ensure you build a deep, specific academic narrative that layers engagement. The plan focuses generally on 5 specific key areas. Curriculum and rigor. We want to ensure that the curriculum and rigor is appropriate based on academic direction. This is an area, as noted, that an admissions officer can simply glance at a transcript, glance at the academic direction, and identify an inconsistency and move on and come to the conclusion that this is not the right student applying to the right program. Then tests. You know, college admissions, it's funny, with coronavirus, have offered way more options as it relates to testing. Right now we have test blind and test optional policies. And I think if you would ask the administrators at the colleges, they think that they're providing more access and it's easier. But I would argue that you need more strategy than ever, especially as an Asian student applying to these schools, about whether or not you should be submitting tests to optional schools is really important. And it's a complex conversation depending on the area you're going into and the school you're applying to. So we focus on making sure that we make the right decision there. Then your in-school extracurricular activities, as noted, this is about building the foundation of engagement and contribution. Then out-of-school extracurricular activities, this is about layered but focused out-of-school engagement. And then finally, engaging in your community. This is self-directed, academically considered community engagement. That means you don't just go to a random, nursing home or soup kitchen. We think about the direction of your application interest, and we think about how you can engage in your community in a meaningful way that somehow is connected to that area of interest. The next part is the college list. Benchmarking the college list is very complex. It requires an in-depth understanding of the interplay between statistics and stories. And if you really want to provide yourself the best chance of earning a top-tier offer, you have to accurately assess your chances and your overall risk profile. I would argue that there are not many people, your guidance counselors included, that really have a good understanding, especially outside of early decision, of the likelihood of a student getting in, especially in regular decision rounds. The college list, one of the biggest mistakes I see is students not understanding the risks they're taking and being in a difficult position thereafter because they incorrectly benchmarked their college list. The third part is application strategy. It's interesting how you apply to college, ED1, ED2, early action, restrictive early action, regular decision, or rolling admission may literally be the most important decision you make. In order to make a strategic application, in order to develop a strategic application strategy, you need to accurately benchmark your list. And the only way you can do that is to overlay that with the application options, ED1, ED2, EA, because they're all different. Let me give you a quick look. I noted Northwestern on the slide because I had just been working with one of my clients that's applying to Northwestern. And they said to me, you know what, John, I love Northwestern. I just don't think I want to commit. I'm just not ready. There are so many amazing schools out there. I don't think I can make this commitment. And so I said to them, okay, let's just go through the stats and I'll let you come to your own decision about whether you want to commit. So here are the numbers. Northwestern gets, last year got 39,263 applications for admission. And of those, 4,411 of them were early decision. So about 11% of their applicant pool apply early decision. That means that 89% of their applicant pool apply outside of early decision. From that 11%, right, 4,400 applications out of 40,000, out of 4,400 applications, they got ED, they filled 58% of all of their spaces with just those 4,400 people. So what happens is by the time you get to regular decision, right, we now have, in theory, 89% of the rest of the applicants fighting for 40% of the spaces, when 11% of the applicants are fighting for 58% of the spaces. I think that makes the point of just how engaged in the ED process colleges are. They would love to fill all of their class ED because it lowers their acceptance rates. If you drill in even further and you say, okay, I see there are 1,105 students who are enrolled from the ED round in a freshman class. If you dove in and you said, who are these people? Who are these 1,100 people? What you'll find is they're almost exclusively white, Indian, or Asian. You don't find many underrepresented minorities, Black and Hispanic, in an early decision round. And on top of that, if you overlay socioeconomic status, almost everybody who applied ED is in the upper levels of socioeconomic status because nobody's committing to paying $50,000 a year before they ever see a financial aid package unless they feel that they can afford it, which means that every single one, for the most part, of the 1,100 students admitted at Northwestern in the ED round were either white, Indian, or Asian and come from a high income background. Now imagine for a moment that you are the admissions director. You just finished your ED round, you're happy, you just filled 58% of your class, you're about to go to the RD round. What would you do, right? You would look at what you just did, right? You'd go back to your ED round and say, I'm just wondering, amongst all of the priorities of the types of students I'm supposed to be bringing in, how many do I already have so that I can inform the types of students I'm going to be taking in the regular decision round? So what happens is they look back, they say, oh, we took a bunch of Indian, Asian, and white students and they're all high income. We need the opposite of that now in regular decision. So quite frankly, regardless of how smart you are, doesn't matter if you're Harvard level material, Northwestern doesn't want you in the RD round. They want you in the ED round. And if you don't apply ED, you're putting yourself in a very, very difficult position. You might get in, but you are not going to get into many schools with low acceptance rates in RD rounds, regardless of how intelligent you are. So it's really important that you benchmark this, you understand these statistics, and that before you say, I'm going to apply to Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Stanford, or MIT, which are the 5 schools in the country that do not offer early decision, that you understand the benefits of ED and the risk you take if you forego ED. After we have built the plan with the associated evidence, appropriately benchmarked the college list, and strategically chose the application options, we are ready to move on to step 4, which is developing the application story. Here we use all of your experiences and all of our insight to build an application for admission that gives you the best chance of earning an offer. And we offer basically A to Z consulting, where we do everything from helping to brainstorm to, of course, editing the content of the final parts of the application. I'll leave you with just a few final thoughts before we jump into the Q&A session. Colleges do not want well-rounded students. They seek a well-rounded class. There is a significant difference. That means universities often seek to admit great physics students, great violinists, great historians, great computer scientists. Together, they create a great, well-rounded class. Your job is to be a piece of that puzzle, because the individually well-rounded students are often on the outside looking in. You have to understand that you are not just competing with the kids in your school or even the kids in your state. You're competing with students around the world. Success requires vision. Success requires a plan. Do you have a vision of what you need to accomplish? Do you understand how to enact that vision? Do you understand how to illustrate the evidence of that journey? It's not just 4 years. The networking value at an elite institution truly lasts a lifetime and provides significant social and financial value. But most importantly, I find that young people flourish when they understand the vision, when they understand the why, when they understand the opportunity. Start early and stay curious. Okay, guys, I know that was dense. I know I talked quickly. I hope you found that helpful. And now I'm looking forward to answering your questions.
Okay, so hey, Joe, I think we got a lot of questions. So, I mean, I try my best to try to repeat every single one, but if some questions I think is maybe too specific, geared towards the specific case of certain family, I probably skip it. But I mean, just let you guys know, because time is limited. So I try my best, okay? So let's go from the first question. So, please clarify Cornell's second language requirement for art and science department. Does 2 years and achieve 5 AP score for foreign language meet the art and science 2 years requirement? You understand?
That's a good question. So the foreign language requirements universally across all of the different institutions are probably the requirement that is most flexibly overlooked. And the reason for that is because a lot of students don't realize that's a requirement until it's too late, and sometimes they don't have the full foreign language requirement. I would say if you have the opportunity to meet the requirement, usually what they're looking for is 3 years. With arts and sciences at Cornell specifically wants 3 years in the same foreign language. And when we say foreign, just to be clear, Chinese for Chinese students generally does not overly valued. So when we say foreign language, we need an actual foreign language. I would say that if the rest of your application is very strong, they will overlook the foreign language requirement that's not met. If the rest of your application is not overly strong, they might use that as a reason to get rid of you. So anything you can do to meet the requirement, and the requirement that I would try to meet would be 3 years of the same foreign language. I also think that if you can't do that because of your high school curriculum, or you're going to be kind of like stopped from other classes, you can illustrate additional exploration by taking a foreign language class outside of your high school. It might, I think it would alleviate some issues. Let's just say you had 2 years at your high school. If you took something outside of school, generally that would be enough as well.
Okay, thank you, John. So before I go to the next question, let me share my screen a little bit. Okay, because we have 2 QR codes, if you can see it. I mean, so it's 2 QR code. One is a little WeChat assistant. You scan this QR code, get into our designated WeChat group for this webinar. And another one, actually, if you want to get to know more about John's service, the application admission service, you can scan the QR code on the right hand. So it's a form. So basically, you can just fill out the form, and me will be the point person, help you to connect with John. So if anybody want to know more about John's service, please scan the QR code and scan the and just fill out the form. 好的，那个大家现在有2个二维码哈，一个二维码是小助手的，您可以扫小助手的二维码进到我们的这一个微信群里面。第2个二维码呢是John的这个升学服务的，因为John呢他不会中文，所以呢就是说我这边会帮他对接我们的家长。如果您对这个John的服务感兴趣的话呢，请你扫一下这个二维码，填一些基本的信息，这样子的话呢也是节约我和John这边的时间。Okay, let's keep going on. Okay, so the next question. So for the Cornell, you guys have the art and science department and also the agriculture department. Which one is more friendly to international students? Or maybe agriculture department might be more easy to accept the the New York State student. Is that true?
Yeah, good question, good point. Generally speaking, first and foremost, for international students, you pretty much have to be full pay to have any chance. If you're applying for financial aid, you have almost no chance at Cornell. They give out like, a very, very less than 5 scholarships total, or even need-based aids, that is, for international students. In regards to which college would be more open, I would say probably arts and sciences, and that's a function of what you just noted. 50% of the enrolled students in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences must come from the state of New York. And because of that fact, there's just less spaces available for basically everyone else. So arts and sciences would, in theory, be more accessible for an international student.
Okay, next question. Would you recommend IB or AP for application for university? I mean, that's very
generally it doesn't matter. I mean, it's based on the curriculum that the high school is offering. The colleges don't have any real, they see more AP because that's more common in the US, but IB is absolutely fine. Some IB students will go out of their way to take the AP exams just to illustrate that they can get a 5 on it. And I have found that, depending on the school, depending on the admissions officer, that can provide some value because of they're just a little more comfortable with the AP. So I would say in 95% of the instances, it doesn't really matter. But if you're a little concerned about that 5% of the time, you can take the AP exam to supplement that.
Okay, so next question. What would be the reasonable score range for SAT and the TOEFL to apply for Cornell?
So the TOEFL, I believe, you kind of have to be minimally over 105 to even be considered. Generally, I think really it was closer to 110 where we were for the TOEFL. In regards to SAT, the SAT in many ways has a diminishing return, meaning that you need to be over a certain number in order to not get filtered out. But once you get over that number, they don't really care whether you have a 1540 or a 1580. It's kind of irrelevant. So generally speaking for Cornell, I always say, you kind of got to get over that 1500 mark to feel comfortable, especially not comfortable if they're going to read your application. In ED, you can be a little lower. You could probably be that. I've had a student 2 years ago that I had admitted to Cornell with a 1390. Why? Because he had a very specific, deep academic story. But generally 1500 is the mark that I focus on, 1450 maybe in ED.
Okay, so basically it's another question actually, a little bit like, at the end of the thread, but I will just ask it because it's related to SAT. So somebody asked, SAT is optional for most of the university this year. Do you think if it is a negative factor for the application of Asian students, since the average of SAT score of Asian students is relatively high? And another person asked, he or she already got SAT score above 1550. So does this person need to take again?
So 1550, no. That's very clear. I would say that's clear across the board. If you look at Harvard, right? Like having a 1600 will not give you much benefit over 1550. So I'd say 1550, you're good. In regards to, I'm sorry, the first question was what again?
It's because the SAT has become optional. So
right.
It's an advantage for Asian kids, yeah.
So what I would say is that
advantage, yeah.
Yeah. So, first of all, the reason that it went optional originally, let's say before coronavirus, colleges that were optional, University of Chicago, for example, great university, test optional, pre-coronavirus, 90% of their enrolled students submitted standardized test scores. So pre-coronavirus, it was never reasonable for an Asian student to apply test optional. Now, post-coronavirus, admittedly, things have changed a little bit. There's more focus on the idea that they can't just have everybody who's optional be underrepresented minorities. And so I think we're going to see more Asian students being taken under the optional policies. That said, my strategy is student takes the test, we identify the school they want, and we look, is the student above the 50th percentile or below the 50th percentile? If they're above the 50th percentile, I don't see a benefit of applying optionally. You should submit the test. If you're below the 50th percentile, in most instances, I would say we should not submit the test, but that depends. I would say, again, most instances, no, but it depends. And the reason for that is, let's just say for argument's sake, again, you have two exactly the same students. One student, they've done exactly the same activities, same grades, same classes, everything. One student is a 1500, one is test optional. I'm pretty confident they're going to go with the 1500. Does that mean you should always focus on the test? No, because if your test score is too low, it's going to do you no favors, and then you should want them to focus on other parts of the application. So 50th percentile and below, I would say you apply optionally.
Okay, next question. Do you suggest that college actually likes someone who has clear major choice in the application based on their interest?
Yes. No question in my mind at all, the answer is yes. The only students, and I tried to give that example earlier, that the ones that identify themselves as undecided, the ones that are desirable are ridiculously impressive students that have engaged and explored in a variety of academic areas, and they just haven't figured out what they want yet, right? That's a reasonable undecided student. And you have to put that application together the right way. I mean, it can't just be kind of scattered all over the place. It's hard to do, but it can be very compelling. For everyone else, and I really believe that's like 95% of the rest of the applicants, it makes sense to identify one area of academic interest and build the entire application around it. If you just simply apply undecided and never really talk about your area of academic interest, at most of the top schools, you will have very little chance. There are a few schools that don't really ask you about it, but they are very few and far between.
Okay, so next one. So actually, I'm a very proud Asian American. I know my surname gave it away, but based on the data you represent, is that better not to classify myself or this audience as Asian when submitting my application?
It's a good question. I think it's clear, right? Like the data illustrates there's some bias against Asian students. I know it's not a quota. I think it's the way they are describing themselves generally, and some general biases against Chinese people in general that we see across the US. In regards to whether or not we should, not identify yourself as Asian, in 90% of the instances, the name, in my experience, the name gives it away, right? Which makes it hard to not. If the name doesn't give it away because there's a kind of like a different last name, it's a questionable to do that, because remember, you're not the only one looking at that application. Your guidance counselor is going to look at that application. And if you're kind of misrepresenting yourself, these guidance counselors talk to the schools, and we should talk about that later on. Like they're an important part of this process. And you do not want to be in a position where the guidance counselor thinks you misrepresented yourself and they have the admissions officer on the phone, right? Because that's kind of game over. So I would say very unlikely that it's a good idea to not identify yourself accurately in that regard. Now, there are other things that you might, not mention on your application. For example, your parents have you want to study biology and both of your parents have a PhD in biology. It would not be a good idea to identify that on your application, because everybody who reads that immediately raises the bar of competitiveness. They say, well, look, the student has access to a lot of resources. So there are certain things you can keep off your application, but I don't think the ethnicity is really one of them. You run a significant risk.
Okay, so next one. What should a supplemental recommendation letter be focused on? What would be an ideal recommendation letter content?
So, college and universities generally require one guidance counselor letter of rec and either one or two teacher recommendations. And so when we get to supplemental letters of rec, I always ask my clients, what is this supplemental rec going to add that we don't already have, right? So we're asking ourselves, is there a certain quality, characteristic, skill set, perspective that is not represented on this application already? I would say I'd go so far as to say 90% of supplemental recommendations have no impact, because they're either saying the same thing that's already in the rec, or they're adding something that is not valued by the university. They don't necessarily care about this aspect that's being added. But certain supplemental recommendations can add some real value, and one of the ones that I like the most, most of my clients will engage in, is when you involve yourself in community exploration, right? And I'll just give the example of, I'm out there exploring my local health bureau. I use that example a lot. I'm exploring my local health bureau because I'm interested in health related stuff. And I'm going to hopefully say, write an article to your local newspaper, or maybe even just your school newspaper. I always suggest to my students, find a mentor, a teacher who can serve as like a sounding board, someone that you can kind of connect with through that process. And the hope is that that person might serve as a supplemental letter of rec. And the supplemental letter of rec would say something to the effect of, the student just kind of decided they wanted to explore X, Y, and Z in their community. They kept me up to date on what they were doing. And here's what they explored. And that supplemental letter of rec will illustrate another aspect of your application, right? That independence, that community exploration. So that would be an example of a valuable supplemental letter of rec. Supplemental letters of rec from your local congressperson generally doesn't have much impact because we know that it's based on privilege. So, those type of things don't matter. Supplemental letters of rec generally have to be personal. Like the person has to actually know the student. That's number one. Or if it's going to be someone impressive, a letter is not enough. Like if you have a relationship with someone who actually has some influence, like a letter isn't enough. You have to get them to pick up the phone and call.
Okay, so now it's a series of questions about ED. So if somebody applied ED2, do we have to wait for the ED1 result in the end of December?
Yes. And so basically you apply ED1, let's just say deadline November 1. You find out generally in early to mid-December, depending on the school, whether you've been accepted ED1, and then deadline for ED2 would be January 1st. So you generally have a 2 to 3 week turnaround time. Of course, you need to prep that ED2 application in advance because 2 weeks generally isn't enough to do it the right way. But yes, you apply ED1, get your response, and then submit your ED2 application.
Okay, so what percentage of acceptance rate for ED2 is similar to ED1 or much lower?
So ED2 is significantly more malleable year over year as it relates to the admissions office. It changes. And the reason for that is because if you think about the entire pool of the students who come in ED, let's just say 100% is ED, right? I would say about 70% is going to be ED1, and somewhere between 25 and 30% are going to be ED2. And I would say that fluctuates rather significantly. If the college gets a great ED pool one year, which happens, right? Like, a school wins a national championship, or they're in the news and they become a little more popular, and all of a sudden the applicant pool bumps up a little bit and they have stronger EDs. Last year, they might have taken, say, 51% in ED1, and now they take 54% in ED1. Well, that would impact the percentage they would have taken ED2. So I always say to families, ED1 is by far the best chance. ED2 is not as good as ED1, but it's way better than regular decision. It's kind of like that middle one. So it's impossible for me to tell you what the admit rates are for ED2 because literally at the same college year over year, it changes based on the quality of the ED1 pool. But ED2, in my opinion, serves as a backup. It serves as the indicator of how aggressive you should be with your ED1 choice. If you have a reasonable ED2 choice, you can be real aggressive with your ED1 choice. If you don't have a reasonable ED2 choice, maybe you should be more conservative with your ED1 choice.
Okay, so some questions about the financial aid. So does ED means there's no financial aid for students who get into ED, or if admitted to ED, that's okay to go to another college because of the financial affordability?
It's a good question. So it's kind of a complex answer. So first and foremost, if you apply early decision, do you get financial aid? Let me take a step back. Financial aid is an umbrella. And underneath that umbrella, we have need-based aid and we have merit scholarship. For merit scholarship, which to be clear, none of the Ivy League has merit scholarship. Stanford, they don't have merit scholarship. As you keep kind of going down, you'll find, let's just say like a place like Duke or Johns Hopkins, they have some merit scholarship, but it's very, very limited. Like very few students get it. Most of the aid that's out there is need-based aid at highly selective colleges. So if you apply to a school that offers merit scholarship and you apply ED to that school, you're not going to get merit scholarship in most instances. Like they'll give it to like one kid just to say they do it, but they know, just like you said, like you're already committed. So there's no reason to give all the student all this merit scholarship money. Need-based aid is a little bit different. It's not as easy to just not give it to the student. So generally speaking, if they apply for early decision and they have financial need at good schools, selective schools, that financial need is met. There's not a difference between the financial aid package you get in ED and the financial aid package you get in regular decision. So you can get need-based aid. Was there a second part of that question? I had another thought in my head, but now I forget what it was. Was there a second part of that question?
So the second part is like if the person get into ED school, but can he go to another school because of maybe he cannot afford?
Yeah, great question. So remember, when you do apply early decision, you will sign a document, your parent will sign a document, your guidance counselor will sign a document, all saying, I understand what the early decision commitment is, and I'm agreeing to it. That said, there are guidelines called the NACAC guidelines for good practices. And that basically is the practices that all colleges and universities, NACAC is the National Association of College Admissions Counselors, that all of the college and universities have to adhere to these guidelines. And one of the guidelines in that document says that if the family cannot afford it, the university must release them from the early decision commitment. Now, they don't define what afford means. And in my experience, no one has ever said like, show me that you got fired from your job. Like no one ever asked that. So if you were to be admitted ED and get accepted somewhere else and say, I don't want to go, the way you would get out of that in theory is you would reach out to the institution and say, I'm sorry, I can't afford this anymore. Maybe a family financial circumstances have changed and I'd like to withdraw my application. In 95% of the cases, they'll just withdraw you. They'll say, okay, we're sorry to lose you, withdraw you, and you're on your way. And it's like never happened. And yes, you can go to that other institution. In some instances where let's just say you do this and then somebody else from your high school also withdraws, right? It's two people from the same high school decide, I'm not going ED. If that happens, usually what happens is the admissions director gets on the phone with the guidance counselor and they complain, right? They start saying like, I guess you guys don't know what early decision is because you signed a document and now I got 2 of your kids not showing up. So the worst thing that usually can happen to a student is not really to the student. It's actually to this high school where they kind of get read the riot act of not informing their students appropriately. If you don't care about that, then yeah, you can kind of usually get out of the ED commitment. And in most instances, they really won't end up calling your guidance counselor. That said, you don't want to just kind of willy-nilly just do whatever you want and ignore the ED commitment, because in some instances, I have seen this, if you apply to 2 schools and they are very similar schools that have relationships, I've seen a student apply ED to 2 schools and those 2 schools withdrew the offer of admission, because you can't apply ED to 2 schools. So you don't want to play too many games, but you also recognize there are ways out of this if you decide it's really not the right spot for you.
Okay, so, and go to the next question. So somebody asked, will the one low B plus adversely impact someone's acceptance into the top school? And some other people ask the similar question, if the grades are not straight A's, but everything else in the application is very good. So can this person still apply to a top school?
I think the answer is yes. Of course, qualified by it depends, right? Depends on what school we're talking about. If we start at, say, Harvard, right, and we say, okay, what does a typical admit look like? First of all, they don't look at GPAs at Harvard, just like we didn't look at GPAs at Cornell, because it's impossible to compare 4.0 scales to 100.0 scales evenly and compare students from different places. So we don't look at GPAs. We look at grades. We look at the courses, the rigor, and the grades in those courses as it relates to the direction. At a place like Harvard, yeah, like I would say everybody in that class who's accepted for the most part will have A's across the board. At Cornell, for example, my staff that, I would direct them, don't even mark down something that is an A, because like I assume all of the grades are A's for the students that we admit, just mark down the grades that are not A's. And so anything that is not an A at any of those schools is going to be noted because most of the students admitted have A's. Does that mean that you're going to be immediately rejected if you don't have an A? I would say no. If you don't have an A in your junior math class and you want to be a computer science major, then yeah, you're probably getting negged immediately on that. But if you're getting a B in sophomore English and you want to be a computer science student, I don't think I know that would not be an immediately, let's get rid of the student. So grades need to be high, but they don't need to be everything. And then the other part that's really important you got to recognize is that colleges and universities read by school group, meaning that we don't take, one student's application from New York and then read a student from North Dakota right next to it because they're too hard to compare. We take the students from your high school and you read them with the rest of the students from your high school, you and your students from your high school together. So the grades in many ways are put within the context of your high school and who else applied to the school that we're talking about. So you apply to Cornell and 15 kids from your high school apply. Well, if 14 of them all have better grades than you, then you're in trouble, right? Like it doesn't matter if all your grades are A minuses. Let's just say for argument's sake, you have straight A's across the board, you have 3 A minuses, but all 14 kids that applied have straight A's. Yes, you are at a huge disadvantage, even though those 3 A minuses, had those other students not applied, might not have hurt you at all, right? So high school context, the people who are applying from your high school also play a significant impact in this whole conversation of grades and where you rank in it.
Okay, so yeah, take a break. Yeah, actually, we still have a lot of questions coming. So, what to do if a student did something for many years but without any state or national awards?
Well, I guess I know it's hard for me to answer that with not knowing what that thing is.
Yeah.
As I think I'd go back to the slide. If you can remember back, I said there's kind of like basically what I'm saying here is that depending on the area of academia and the selectivity of the school, that really determines whether you need what we refer to as objective achievement, right? Objective achievement being, I haven't had national or state level success in competition. I would say, in my experience, at most of the schools that offer ED, right? Like, Penn, Cornell, Brown, Duke, Hopkins, all those type places, you can get in without objective achievement if you build the story correctly and it's deep and specific. I would say for Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Stanford, MIT, usually you do need objective achievement, something that illustrates that someone says you're really great in this when it's all said and done. So what would I do? I guess I would either kind of shift if my focus was in Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Stanford, MIT, I'd shift it to a school that's a tiny bit less selective. Or you kind of change direction. If the area we're talking about right now is a clear STEM area, there's oftentimes very easy minor shifts that you can make from a clear STEM area to a STEM/social science area. And that would lower the bar of competition. And oftentimes, without objective success, you can be successful in those academic areas.
Okay, so according to your past experience, what are the typical athletic and artistic engagement among Asian students you find? So do you recommend Asian kids actually devote time in those, very specific activities, or you only encourage them keep going to do whatever they truly love?
Of course, there's nothing wrong with art, music, or athletics. And if the student had everything else already, right, this really great, deep academic story, then sure, it's nice that you play, you're a fencer or that you're involved in tennis. Like, that's nice, but it's not a needle mover, right? Like I always say to students, like, our job is to move the needle, to get someone to say, there's a reason we want to take the student. And no matter how amazing you are at tennis, or no matter how eloquently you describe it in your personal statement, in the end, tennis itself, unless you're planning on playing it, has no real impact. So what I always say is, if you're not going to be a recruited athlete, it's not valuable. That doesn't mean to stop it. I love sports more than anyone. I think it's good for the mind, body, and soul, but it's not helping in college admissions, right? So that's number one as it relates to athletics. Art and music are different, in that what we find is that a lot of really smart students happen to be musically or artistically, but oftentimes musically inclined. And what we find is that we look at the results. We say, oh, that student got into Harvard, that kid got into Penn, that kid got into Cornell. And then we see that they were musically involved, and we say, well, you must have to be involved musically. But the fact of the matter is, most of the time, music had nothing to do with it. They just happened to be involved musically, and there was something else about this academic interest. When do you lean into music? When do you lean into art? If you have a portfolio that you're proud of, that can be super powerful in college admissions. So if you're like, hey, I've done a lot of art, the portfolio is really strong, you could literally apply as an art major and still be a computer science or economics major in a College of Arts and Sciences. That's a viable strategy. I've had 2 students say, I'm a fantastic artist. I'm going to use my portfolio to get in, and then I'm going to kind of change direction, although art will always be part of my life. That's one way. And same, I would say exactly the same thing with music. You can audition, and if you audition and they want you, that is something that can move the needle. Even if academically, maybe you're not as amazing as someone else. If the music department wants you, that can be really powerful. So auditions or portfolios, if you feel you're at that level, then that can be a viable strategy. If you're not at that level, then it's just for fun. And it's part of your development that has nothing to do with this specific goal.
Okay, so some audience ask, so actually it's like from a student, this question. So if she put down as physics and philosophy major, do you think it will be a little bit too unfocused? And so do you think, I think maybe this scenario apply to other students too, maybe like to totally like, different
Sure.
majors. Yeah.
I think that that these synergies between these kind of different academic disciplines are becoming more clear all the time. And I think that I just did a student who's doing a philosophy/ethics physics application, and I think it turned out amazingly well. There are a lot of subtleties. There are a lot of unique observations. I mean, she really kind of dove into, she's also an artist, right? And she dove into kind of like how art and not always being focused on a specific answer allows her to be a stronger theoretical physicist, right? So I think there are lots of ways to take different academic disciplines and illustrate the synergy and how one or the other adds to the overall strength of the student in one of those areas. So I think it can be done. I think it just has to be done thoughtfully and strategically. I think if you keep them completely separate, you run some level of risk that you don't provide enough depth for either, right? So you say, here's physics, here's philosophy, and yeah, you kind of a physics student, but not as strong as the students who focus just on physics, and kind of a philosophy student, but not as much as the students who focus just on philosophy. So you have to be the one who can illustrate the interplay between them. So it definitely can be done. It's just harder to do.
Okay, cool. So still the question from the same audience. So basically, she asked, is the AP score of 4 in my intended major actually is a bad score, but the rest of AP are all 5?
I always say to depends on what schools we're talking about, but generally speaking, if I say schools in the top 25, a 1 or a 2 or 3 will negatively hurt you. A 4 does nothing, and a 5, can help or, provide some value. I have another student exactly like this who has 5s across the board, a 4 very specifically in the program she's applying to. She has an A in the class. And so we have her guidance or her teacher writing basically a letter that says something to the effect of, this score, this 4 is clearly not representative of the student's ability. I think the answer to the question is, yeah, it's going to raise some eyebrows to get the lowest score you have to be in the area you tell us you're going into. And I think that there's probably an opportunity to explain that in some way.
Okay, so next AP question. How many AP courses should be taken in order to get accepted by the top 10 universities? Will 10 AP course or 14 course make huge difference?
That's, again, it's very tough because it's very high school dependent. Some of these high schools provide so many AP courses. I have a student from Texas right now who, he has 23 AP courses right now. And, he is a very impressive student, but he's also a product of a school that pushes tons and tons of AP courses. Generally speaking, I say in order to be taken seriously at a school like Cornell, which has a 10% acceptance rate or below, you need double-digit AP courses, generally speaking. Is there a diminishing return? I would say not really. Is there a benefit between 10 and 14? Yes. The more AP courses you take to illustrate, academic ability in more areas with more 5s, definitely is valuable. Now, you don't have to take 20, right? But what I always say is you need to find out, number 1, how many AP courses does your high school offer? Number 2, how many AP courses do the best kids in your high school take? You need to ask your guidance counselor. Last year, the kid who got accepted to wherever, how many AP courses they take? If they took 24, and you're taking 12, then 12 is not that good, right? If they took 13 and you're taking 12, well then, you're probably in a pretty good spot.
Okay. So how many colleges in total would you recommend your clients to apply to? What's the average and what's the minimum and the maximum number?
I believe the Common App actually stops you, I think, at 20, if I remember correctly. But of course, you can apply through the Coalition app as well. So in theory, you could apply to as many as you want. The fact of the matter is that for Asian students, Asian, Indian, white students from high income areas, ED is by far your best chance of getting in. If you don't apply ED1 or ED2, or you don't get in ED1 or ED2, you're in a significantly more difficult position in regular decision. And so, my clients generally apply somewhere between 7 and 10 schools because I know whether they're going to get an ED1 or ED2, right? I generally have a pretty good feel for that. And so we don't have to spin our wheels with huge, long lists. If you don't know whether you're going to get an ED1 or ED2, or you know that you're being super aggressive and you just say, hey, I want to take my shot. I'm applying to Harvard and I'm applying to, Columbia. Not that you could do that because you wouldn't be able to do ED1 and ED2 there, but let's just say for argument's sake, very, very aggressive. Then, you should apply to a lot of schools in regular decision because again, it depends on what admit rates we're talking about. I always go back to my experience at Lehigh. Lehigh University has an acceptance rate of approximately, say, 30%. And I can clearly recall the calls from the alumni, right? I handled all the calls from the angry alumni for the kids who didn't get in. And they would call me and say stuff like, just so you know, Lehigh was his backup, right? He didn't even want to go there. That's his backup. He really wanted to go into X school and he got into X school. That's what they'd say. And I would always say we know that, right? We knew that we were their backup and that's why you got waitlisted. So you really do have to be aware that these colleges want to feel special and you have to know exactly what they are offering and what you can provide there. And if they offer ED and you don't apply ED, you're going to be in a difficult position.
Okay, this question, how and where can you present the academic narratives in the application? I think you touch upon this topic, right?
The academic narrative is not a real thing. It's made up by me, right? Meaning that an academic narrative are all the things you've done from 9th to 12th in theory that are connected to the area of academic interest and connected to each other. And I don't think you can build an application, a good one, without either knowing it in your head or having put it down on paper. And I think most of the time, putting it down on paper. So where does that academic narrative go? The academic narrative has all of the elements that you will put in your application. You're not just going to take the narrative and plop it in, but you're going to take all the different pieces and they will serve as the elements of your application that build the story.
Okay, and then this one leads to another question. How early is a student expected to know what he or she wants to study? 8th grade, 9th grade, how do one manage the risk of focusing heavily on one area too early and later find out the children interested in something else?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, just to be clear, nobody expects them, certainly in 7th or 8th or 9th grade, to know what they want to do. In fact, we know that they probably don't know what they want to do even when they get to college. If you went into an admissions office and you said, is it okay if a student doesn't know what they want to do? They would say yes, right? Because we all know it's silly to expect a 7th, 8th, or 9th grader to know what they want to do with the rest of their lives. But the fact of the matter is that when we actually read the application, the students who act like they know what they want to do with the rest of their lives are the ones who get in because they create these deep, clear stories. So I would suggest that the earlier, the better. It doesn't really matter whether it's 9th grade, or 10th grade necessarily. It just matters, do we have enough elements of the story? So, if you don't identify what you're interested in until, say, 11th grade, that could be okay as long as you're able to fit all of the elements you need of the story into such a short period of time. And depending on the area of academic interest, it's harder. So, in social sciences, sometimes it's not that hard to do and you can do it in a short period of time. In the STEM areas where you need to have say in-lab research and you need to build on the experiences, it's hard to get that done in such a short period of time. So getting back to your question of how early, what I do with all of my clients is, if you remember the slide, there are only really 3 options, right? There's business, there's engineering, and there's arts and sciences, which is everything else. And so what I really focus on early on with students who are young is, do we have any interest in exploring business? Do we have any interest in exploring engineering? If the answer is yes, kind of, then we get them to summer programs, right? To get them at least engaged in that. And if they come back from the summer program and say, I love engineering, okay, then we have a direction. They come back from the summer program and say, I love this business stuff, then we have a direction. If they come back from the summer program and say, I don't like either of them, then we have a direction, because the new direction is now arts and sciences, because that's the catch-all, everything else. Once we've identified the college, and I think you can do that rather early with a student, engineering, business, or everything else. Once we know the college, everything else is a lot easier, because now our only goal is simply to get into the college. So I guess the point here is, yes, it's a big decision early to identify the college, but it's not a huge life-defining decision, because let's just say I can't define the college. I'm going to go with the College of Arts and Sciences. In the College of Arts and Sciences, you have everything from computer science and economics and biology and chemistry to Greek literature, the classics, right? So it's a very broad college. The goal is to at least identify that's the college we want to get into. And then we can start to make recommendations about how to build a profile to prepare for that college. By the time you hit sophomore, junior year, then you do need to get a little more narrow than what college we're applying to. You need something related to academic program. But like, as I said to the students, let's just say, and I have a student right now who I'm like begging to choose because it's just getting too late. And I keep saying to them, remember, you're only choosing how you're applying to college, right? Like, you're going to be in a College of Arts and Sciences. When you get there, you can change your mind. We need to decide how you plan to apply. If you wait, you're never even going to get in, right? So we're not making life-defining decisions here. We're making how we apply to college-defining decisions.
Okay, somebody asked, so how do parents' education and job title impact the admission? So maybe some poor people, poor family maybe have advantage, or rich people, a rich family kind of advantage, a disadvantage.
So it depends very much so on school. At weaker schools, the parents' backgrounds being strong usually plays very well, because the colleges feel a level of comfort that, parents have a PhD or they're vice president of a company. And so there's some level of support that will be provided to the student. At highly selective elite colleges, I would argue that's probably the opposite, where having parents who are highly educated or very successful raises the bar of competition. So, I guess I always say that for example, I have a young lady who's applying as a neuroscience student. Her father is a neurologist. That's not going to help her on the application, because they're just going to say, well, look at all those experiences you have. Most students wouldn't have those experiences because their father isn't a neurologist. So we're not going to put down that that the father's a neurologist, because it's really not pertinent to the student's application. And I think it will harm them in this process. So, you don't want to don't make things up. That's number one. You don't want to make up titles or stuff like that. But leaving off job titles or degrees, I think it can be valuable. And I would say advanced degrees or job titles that clearly indicate, high levels of success don't do any benefit to the student in highly selective schools.
Okay, next question. What impacts do supplemental materials have? So do you have any example of a very effective supplemental materials submission?
I'm not sure that I know what they're referring to as supplemental material. Do you mean like any just random stuff that you submit?
So maybe recommendation letter, I think so. Anything, besides the test score or awards. Yeah.
I mean, I would say that in most instances, submitting additional stuff doesn't help you. And most of the time it's just thrown away. I remember we used at Cornell and Lehigh, people would submit their research papers. They'd be like this thick, on binders. And, people, will do lots of crazy things, put like the school's logo on a bunch of M&Ms and send it to the admissions office. Like they did that too. It doesn't really have an impact. I would say you have to understand that the applicant, first of all, we hire a certain number of people to read a certain number of applications in college admissions, right? This is an industry, just like everything else. You a certain number of people to do a job. And very clearly, they have 12 minutes to read that application. 12. It's not 6, it's not 20, it's 12 for the most part across the country with minor variations. And so to that end, you can't really just submit whatever you want and expect that they're going to look at it. I always tell my clients, if it's not in the application, even if you submit a resume, right? Like a resume, just to be clear, the application is a resume. Right? Like that's what an application is. So if you submit a resume ancillary to the application, generally they won't read it. And so what I tell my students is anything that you want to be counted, you've got to have in your application. You cannot assume that something supplementary is actually going to be considered. I know this because I run reports on my counselors who work for me to see their open rates of documents that are not required. It's literally less than 30%. Why? Because they've only had 12 minutes to read the application. So I would keep supplemental information very, very limited. And it's hard for me just to say what kind is valuable. It's really a case-by-case basis to identify whether it's of value. And if you send too much, you run the risk of annoying the admissions office because they don't really want all that content.
Okay, so I will ask a last question, and then I probably will give the chance to several parents just open the mic to ask a question. Yeah, okay. Sure. So the last question, if an Asian boy and an Asian girl both apply for the same STEM major, and both of them, got a similar academic and extracurricular achievement, do you think the girl has better chance than the boy?
That depends on the school again. If it was Carnegie Mellon, absolutely, right? Like if you look at the gender distribution from school to school, you'll see a place like Carnegie Mellon or a place like MIT is very male dominated. When you look at the distribution of gender for smaller private liberal arts colleges, it's very female dominated. So listen, in this process, being different in any way is always valuable, right? So if there's more women, then it's better to be a man. If there's more men, then it's better to be a woman. I had a student last year admitted to, and Carnegie Mellon comes to mind because I've seen such a clear disparity for men specifically. STEM area is super hard. Female in a social science or humanities area, quite frankly, not that difficult. So it depends on the school. You really should be looking at the distribution of gender for the schools you're applying to, across the board.
Okay, Kathy Tsai.
Hello, I have a question. How will admission officer view private school versus public school? I heard that private schools are not offering AP exams. So for students without AP exams, what should they do? How do they compete with public schools? Thanks.
I'm not sure that I'm familiar. I mean, most of the students that I have that go to private schools are taking AP exams, but if they're not offering it at the high school, many students will go elsewhere, reach out to other educational institutions, high schools, to see if they can take the AP exams elsewhere. So I would say that, I always I get questions a lot about like, will the admissions office understand that, we're in the middle of a pandemic and it wasn't offered? And I think the answer is clearly yes, right? Like we all know that coronavirus and the pandemic impacted everyone in every way. But it's not about whether they understand, it's about what your competition has done. And if your competition has taken those courses, then you're at a disadvantage. And I would say that based on my experience, that they are in fact taking those classes, those AP exams. In regards to public school versus private school, in my experience, if a student is very smart, top of the class, it doesn't really matter whether you go to a public school or a private school. If a student is kind of like, they're smart, right? They're a good student, but they're not the most amazing student. That's when you see a benefit for private schools because the colleges, universities will they will dive a little deeper into the class at a top tier private school, right? So if you go to Lawrenceville or you go to Harvard Westlake, they're going to take someone with a lower GPA from that high school than they will from a public school. So good students, the best students, it doesn't matter. For good students, you do get some level of benefit from being at a prep school.
Okay, Guo Lin.
Hi, the question is it a good strategy to apply for music major with international competition award than engineering in the beginning, then transfer to engineering later for Stanford? From strategy perspective.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, just being completely honest with you, off the top of my head, I'm not 100% sure what the transfer process looks like from music to engineering at Stanford specifically. So I'd have to take a look. But generally speaking, sorry, what was that?
They're within the same school, within the same college. I think, you talked about earlier before that within the college, it's easier comparing to between college is more difficult.
So if they are in the same college, then yes, it does make sense to go that route. Of course, depending on the quality of the evidence on each side, right? So, for example, if I have a student right now who, wants to apply computer science, heard my presentation and says, well, John, you told me computer science is the hardest. Why would I apply computer science? And the reason for that is we're applying computer science is because the evidence is so strong on the computer science side. If I were to shift him to something that's not computer science related, I'd have to get rid of all that evidence. Right? Like I can't have all the CS evidence and then pretend he's a public policy major. And so you have to balance the competitiveness with the evidence. If we look at your situation, we say, okay, musician versus engineering, it's really a question of how strong is the evidence in engineering versus how strong is the evidence in music. And I think Stanford has auditioning, an audition process. And this is not my area, like music really is not my thing, but admittedly, if he was able to audition and they think if you had him evaluated and they said, yeah, he's going to do well in an audition, then yes, I would argue it's probably better to go the route of music, because when the engineering department won't have the chance, it's not the same thing, right? The engineering department doesn't say, I want that kid based on the engineering project he did. It doesn't work that way. Whereas the music department will say, I want that kid based on the audition. So there's a more direct pull based on that specific area of academic interest for music. So if he's a fantastic musician, I would very much consider that route.
Thank you.
Okay. So next one, Michael Wang. You can unmute. So Michael Wang, if you are not here, I go to the next one, okay? Okay, Su Wang Su. Can you speak? Wang Su.
I see Michael's question here, and I'm just going to answer it because I think it's actually a very important question that I probably should have noted earlier.
Okay.
The pre-med is not a major. That was the question. Is pre-med a major? The answer is no. And generally speaking, pre-med, pre-law, the colleges don't care that you want to go to medical school, and they don't care that you want to go to law school, at least at the admission stage. At some point they might care, but at this stage they don't. What they want to know is about your undergraduate plans. So you do not want to focus your application on, even if you are pre-med, which as I said is not a good idea to even identify in your application, but if you do in fact identify it, you don't want to build your application around the idea of medicine, because you're not being admitted to a medical school, right? You're being admitted to an undergraduate college. So you need to identify an undergraduate major, and that's the focus of your application. Same thing with law school. You don't want to talk about law. As it relates to what are these things, pre-law and pre-med are tracks. They're just simply identifying an advisor who's going to say, oh, you're pre-med. Okay, we need to make sure you take these courses, and we need to make sure that you're prepped for the MCAT. But for law school, it's literally nothing. Just, hey, you're going to law school, prepare for the LSAT. So identifying those two things on your application generally provide almost no value, and identifying pre-med absolutely, positively, 100% makes it way harder to get in.
Okay, the next one, James Guo.
Hi. So if one student want to apply to College of Science, Arts and Science for math major or computer science major, a STEM major, and usually college require 2 recommendation letters from 2 teachers, right? Can both teachers for recommendation from like STEM classes, like math teacher and chemistry? Or do we have to have one from humanity, like English teacher?
I think that the one thing you absolutely must have is at least one STEM, right? You can't apply to a STEM area and have no recs STEM. So that's a definite. Whether you have 2 STEM recs or whether you have 1 STEM rec with a social science or humanities teacher, in my opinion, with my clients, it'd be based upon the strength of the rest of the application. If this student is like clearly STEM, the strength is there, there's lots of engagement, it's deep, and it's not even a question, then I probably would go with a letter of rec that illustrates the other side of them, a humanities or social science rec. If it's not so clear, then I would want to hammer home that this is an area of strength with another letter of rec in that space.
Okay, so I think Wang Su actually typed the question in the chat box. So whether taking a Cornell summer class help with admission into Cornell?
Generally, no. The colleges don't, that the summer division at every single college is in fact like a separate division. Nobody knows the summer people at a college, in all honesty. Like they don't know the faculty, they don't know the program directors, just like their own little animal summer division. And yeah, no, it would, and it won't hurt you, but it doesn't help you either. The only way it could help you is if your identifying, because you're there, you're identifying unique opportunities about how you're going to build your application. But the experience of the program, or even a letter of recommendation from the program, the person who ran the program, generally has no real impact.
Okay, so I think right now we are almost 11. Maybe we give 10 more minutes and then we just wrap it up, okay? Because we still have over 400 people staying in line. But I think a lot of parents raise their hands, but we try to answer as many questions as possible. Okay, next one, Vivian Liu.
Hi, John. I have a question. Like basically on the application, will parent needed to release the place they work for or the company they own, something like those information?
It's really not necessary. If you don't want to, you don't have to. And in some instances, it makes sense not to. I think like high titles or strong degrees generally don't provide much value. The other thing is sometimes I have students who will do, engagement experiences like at their parents' company, right? Like, of course, if you note that that's the parents' company on the app, then it will be of almost no value, right? So there's generally many good reasons you might not list certain aspects of the parents' background on the app. And there's no real downside to not listing it. I think if it's there, it's there. If it's not there, it's not there. Nobody really pays attention to it. So
on the form, there is a place like you need to, or it's optional. Maybe you need to fill up the name of the company, right? This information is on the form, right? On a certain form, is that right? Oh yeah, it's there, but again, you can, I don't know if people are just like putting a space and leaving it, but I've seen it blank a million times, right? Like you don't actually have to fill it out. I see. And another question is, if the student, I just heard you mention about the, school club situation. If the student has a very excellent GPA and, did more than one research with a professor, and also had an internship at a very prominent, I think it's a very reputable internship at a national level NGO, but does a student still need to invest additional time to be a leader in a school club? Well, as I said, I believe that high school engagement is foundational. Colleges, ask themselves the question of, will the student take advantage of the resources in front of them in school, right? No matter how smart the student is, if they're gonna sit in their dorm room and play video games all day, they're not gonna take advantage of the resources. And so to that end, there is a question of whether the student takes advantage of the resources available to them in their high school. Are there students who get admitted to top tier schools with no high school engagement? Yes, of course. If there's tons of out of school engagement that's really compelling, that might certainly be enough to overcome it. But I would say that it certainly will catch people's attention if there is no in-school engagement. The second part of your question, whether it needs to be, illustrate leadership, I think leadership, oftentimes people think of structural leadership, like I'm captain or vice president. I don't think that that's necessary. I think the way you illustrate leadership is through the way you describe your contribution to the community that you're talking about. So you don't need to get to like some level at your in-school organization to make it count. But I do think, in my opinion, I don't have any of my clients ever apply with zero in-school engagement because I know it will raise a red flag. That doesn't mean you can't overcome it, but I think it raises a red flag. But for the
Vivian, so it might be too many questions from you.
Sure.
So okay.
Sure.
Yeah. So if you have more questions, you can just private message me, and if I have a chance, I will give to John. So,
sure. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. So, and I saw one question in chat box. So, John, for your college admission service, do you have stronger focus on one of the three majors, business versus engineering versus art and science? Also, can you share the breakdown of your clients, like how Chinese or versus non-Chinese, US versus non-US?
Sure. So in regards to the strength of the programs, generally you'll see the highest standardized test scores in the engineering area. Generally, you'll see the most rigorous curriculum in the STEM areas of arts and sciences and engineering, right? So if you say, chemistry, physics, biology, computer science, and arts and sciences, and then the engineering disciplines, you'll see the most rigor.
So I would say generally, like the STEM disciplines of arts and sciences plus engineering is probably where we're going to see the most competition from a data perspective, highest SATs, highest, strongest overall curriculum. You know, when you shift, when you're talking about different types of people, right? Like when you go to the social sciences or the humanities, or if you go into business, it's not that they're weaker at top tier schools. It's just that their skill sets and the way they're describing themselves is different. And so if you don't have the stats, you're not going to be just wiped out right away like you are in the STEM areas of arts and sciences and engineering. They're actually going to look at your application generally in even business, unless it's like Wharton or Stern. They're going to look at it. And same thing with the non-STEM areas of arts and sciences. So engineering generally the hardest, and then like as it relates to stats, and then like the arts and sciences of the STEM of arts and sciences, number 2. And business is unique in that most of the business schools are very small, and so they have low acceptance rates because of the size as opposed to the competition. I think what you find in the business area is that the competition is not as high actually, but the spaces are super, super small or tight. In regards to my clients, I would say about, I don't know, maybe 65 to 70% are Asian students. And then the remaining 30 to 35% are a mix of Indian and white students. And I have maybe 1 or 2 underrepresented minorities. So what was the second part of the question about my students?
Okay, so it's a breakdown of your students, such as US versus non-US students, and Chinese versus non-Chinese students. Yeah.
Yeah, so Chinese is I would say somewhere around 65%, I would say approximately. In regards to international versus domestic, I would say it's closer to 90% domestic, maybe even 95. I think I have a few international students. The fact of the matter is that it's way harder, just to be clear, as an international student than is a domestic student. That's not the reason I don't have more. I think most of the spaces I'm in are domestic platforms. So yeah, I managed our international process at Cornell, so it's something I'm very familiar with.
Okay, next one. Quincy?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, John, for 2 hours here. It's a long time. So I actually have 2 questions. The first one is about private schools. I wonder if the private school college counselors really do have some kind of relationship with college admission officers. Are they really helpful? And what about the quota? You just now mentioned in private schools, actually the college might go a little lower for GPA, but I actually heard another voice. They're saying for private schools, it's very hard for students to be more competitive because everyone is so good. So we should actually go to public school. So if you're a normal student at private school, you may be the top one at public school. So what do you think about that?
So sorry, what was the first part? I just remember. I'll answer that second part about which school to go to. But what was the first part?
The first part is about
the
college counselors at private schools. Are they really, have some kind of special relationship, as we heard?
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, I think the idea of public versus private, right? As I said, I do think that they will go deeper in the class. Now, this again depends on what school we're talking about, right? Mm-hmm. So like at Harvard or Princeton or Yale, like they're not going deep in the class no matter what. Mm-hmm. If you get to a place like Cornell, and I'll use that as the example, right? Like we're definitely going to go a little deeper in the class at a place like Lawrenceville, right? Than we're going to go at a public school. So I would say at a place like Cornell, it's probably, beneficial to be at the private school. Now, your point of, well, what if I was the number 1 student at the public school, which of course we don't 100% always know that to be true. I mean, I hear a lot of families say that, but there's always somebody at the public school that's competition, right? It's not like there's nobody smart there. If you were in fact number 1 at the public school, yes, that would be more compelling than being lower in the class in the private school. So, if we knew that to be true, it definitely would be better to be top couple in a public school than be number 30, at a private school. But again, it's so hard to know what that means exactly and to make that strategic decision.
Yeah.
That'd be now. In regards to the actual benefit of private schools, thank you for this question. I really should have said this earlier. Mm-hmm. It's super important. Some people hire me and they think they don't need their guidance counselors anymore. And they do. Like these guidance counselors are super, super, super important. And basically what happens is just like everything, I think in the real world, like this industry is incestuous, right? Like all the guidance counselors know all the admissions officers because literally every single year we go to conferences together. NACAC, which is the National Association of College Admissions Counselors, is in, I think, Colorado right now. It actually might have just ended, and I saw all the posts from all my friends, like all the guidance counselors, all the admissions people, they're all having dinner and having beers together. Those relationships are developed. And what happens is there's a period of time right before the admissions decisions go out. Mm-hmm. It's called Counselor Call Week. And it's literally a week where these private schools are calling the admissions offices. And the conversation basically goes like this. They get on the phone and they say, hi, John, it's Susie from blah, blah, blah school. And it was great seeing you out in NACAC last year. We got to grab a beer again this year, rebuilding that relationship. And then they say, you know how annoying the parents are who live in my area, right? That's what they say. And they say, I got to be prepared. I got to know, I have an idea of how these students are going to do in order to prep these parents. And so, of course, the admissions office doesn't just read the answers out. We do what we say, and this is literally universal. Maybe not Harvard, maybe not Princeton, but like Cornell, Penn, all those places are doing it. They will say something to the effect of, John's reading well, and Lynn's reading medium, and Vivian's reading poorly, right? It means John's getting in, Lynn's getting waitlisted, Vivian's getting rejected. And then what happens is the guidance counselor says, oh, thank you so much. It's so great to know that. Just so you know, I know John's reading well, but he doesn't really want to go to your school. Lynn, who's reading medium, she's dying to go to your school. And you have to understand the difference between these students is so minute that they're just literally flipping these decisions right there in those calls. Mm-hmm. That happens for a whole week right before the decisions go out. And it happens again, right after all the students are waitlisted, right? Who's getting off the wait list? Well, when the guidance counselor picks up the phone and says, hey, John, can you look at that student? Like that's who we look at. So the guidance counselors are super important. Yes, usually the private schools are the ones that are making more of those calls, but public schools do it as well. Mm-hmm. And a lot of families don't realize it's happening. If you go in there and you ask the guidance counselor, you don't say like, if you're working with me, you don't tell them that, but you say like, I've heard something to the effect of there's something called guidance counselor calls. And most of them say like, yeah, we do that. They're like surprised that you don't know that they do it. Mm-hmm. And most families don't realize it. So very important. And the question about private, yes, it's true. At the top prep schools, most of the people working there have worked in college admissions at some point. Now, were they the dean or director? No, because nobody's leaving the position as director of admissions at Cornell to become the guidance counselor at high school. Exactly. But they were in admissions somewhere.
So they were in the circle.
They were in the circle, yeah.
So it's very important that the students get, familiar with the counselor so they know exactly what's happening so they can bring you up, basically.
100%. And, as it relates to Asian students, it's just factually true in my experience that most of the time they don't have nearly as strong a relationship with the counselor as some of the other ethnicity students. They just don't engage in that way. And so when it comes time to garner some support from them to get a phone call, sometimes they struggle.
By relationship, you actually mean just get your voice heard and let them know about you, right?
Yeah, like a legitimately genuine relationship. Like I value your opinion. I'm not just trying to get something from you in this one moment.
Yes, great. Thank you so much. I have another question about recommendation letter. Do you think we should have someone who really knows about our girls? I have two girls to write for them, or someone who's really big in the field, but, kind of know about them?
In most instances, it's better to know about them because, again, of course, it depends on what you mean by big in the field, right? I mean, sometimes big in the field matters and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah.
But generally, if it's not big in the field where I'm going to read it and be like, wow, I'm going to have to take a second look at this person because of what I see here, which happens, of course. If you don't have that, then it's better to know that they know the student.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Got it.
Okay, so maybe we give the last chance. Okay, so Leah?
Yes, thank you. John, thanks for your presentation. Just, you mentioned a very good point, which is the students that come from parents are highly accomplished or with very advanced degrees tend to sort of, in the admissions process, tend to be disadvantaged a little bit. Now, what do you suggest as to helping them to differentiate themselves? And specifically, even if you don't put down what your parents do, during the interview process, through the conversation, they may ask, oh, how did you get interested in neurology, and well, because I grew up in a family of neurologists and so on and so forth. So what's the sort of like the fine line in terms of what to disclose and what not to disclose, and also how to help them to differentiate themselves more?
So first and foremost, I think it's never, like, at least with my applicants, I don't think it's a good idea, even though it's probably true that say a neuroscience interest came from a parent who's in that space. Like, that can't be the reason. It can't be the motivation or the impetus in your application, and it shouldn't be in your interview. If it is, you need to change that aspect of your story, because it's just too common. And it's, again, like in this space where we have to use every word, both in the application and in the interview, to move the needle, to get them to make a decision of yes over somebody else, you can't afford to use things that are not going to move the needle. And identifying that as the motivation is not going to do it. In regards to the interview itself, just to be clear about the interviews, most of the interviews at top tier schools are non-evaluative, meaning that they're not actually part of the review process, because they don't have enough people to actually do all the interviewing. They can't require it and thus can't make it evaluative. And because it's not evaluative, it's generally not done by the admissions officers, it's done by alumni. And so in those instances, really all you can do in those are generally hurt yourself by showing up late or not knowing anything about the school. The positive stuff doesn't really benefit you in non-evaluative interviews, because not everyone does it and they're not allowed to use it. And I don't, if you identified that in your interview, that was the impetus, that would not show up in the application. Like, they're not using what's being written in the interview about the student really in that way, generally speaking. In regards to differentiating your student, I'm not sure that I 100% understood that aspect of it. Like, I think generally differentiating is about depth and specificity, unless you're, just unique by yourself, you have a unique areas of interest, or if you're just a kind of a regular person with regular interest, depth and specificity with layered engagement that shows the ability to examine that from your community perspective, your academic perspective, a club perspective, right? Like, now you are providing different experiences, although it's all centered and funneled around the same story narrative.
Okay, great. That's very helpful. Just quick follow-up. What if one of the parents is a graduate of that school that you're applying for? Is it worthwhile to mention that, or it doesn't help a whole lot?
Well, that's different. So that's like, if you're legacy status, when I say legacy status, we're saying the parent graduated undergrad, because they don't care about graduate school, undergrad from that school. That certainly does play a role. Now, at most schools, it only plays a role in the early decision rounds. Like, they'll say, okay, if you want to, literally, if you actually go to the alumni events that they have, and they generally, most of these schools have like alumni events that will have someone from the admissions office talk about admissions for legacy candidates. And most of those schools will say, if you want to use your legacy hook, and that's what we call it, a hook, you need to apply ED to use it. In RD, you've said this is not your first choice, so we can say we're not going to use the legacy hook. But it is important.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, so John, do you think we should wrap it up? So I know we still have some questions, but I mean, maybe next month or things like that, we invite John come back again, because it's super late now. So thank you guys. We still have 372 people stay online, and still some people raise your hand. We really appreciate you spending your weekend night to come to this webinar. And so, I mean, but you guys can join our WeChat group. If we have more webinars coming up, we definitely will share the news in our WeChat group. And like I said, if you want to know more about John's service, John do have some limited capacity for this year's application, but not too much. So, I mean, if you want to know more about this, please scan the QR code, and 小助手 WeChat assistant will contact you. Okay, so thank you, John. Thank you very much. So thank you, everybody. So, I mean, I still gonna share the screen a little bit and let people scan the QR code, and let's call it tonight. Okay.
The last thing, thank you, Allison. The last thing I'll just say is that I do have somewhat limited capacity, but I do have a team. I provide one of the packages, if anyone reaches out, is kind of like strategic oversight by me and my team implementation. I have some fantastic people. So I'll just throw that out there. Thank you everyone for your time, energy, and attention. And Allison, thank you so much for setting this up. Appreciate it.
Okay, bye-bye. So,
bye-bye.
So, I mean, if you want to know more about no, 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade package from John. Yeah, that's more, more capacity over there. So just scan the QR code and fill out the form. 好的，那个感谢各位今天的参与哈，我们今天问题确实是非常多的，然后下次呢，我们看一下 John 的这一个时间，看能不能再邀请他来分享一次。如果大家就是对 John 的这个分享都非常的满意的话，行，那感谢，看一下。OK, recording has stopped. 大家如果您对除了对John有什么问题之外呢，如果对我们的这个思慧平台有问题的话呢，您也可以示意一下我哈，我可以 unmute， 然后大家可以可以来问我问题。如果没有问题的话呢，大家就可以退出这一个直播间了。我现在我看一下哈，我让大家能 unmute。我看一下。好的，现在如果您有问题的话，应该您是可以直接 unmute。如果没有问题的话呢，欢迎大家退出这个直播间。是还有人在举手吗？我看一下
是的，有5个人在举手。
行 ，Connie 鱼，还有我看您是刚刚举手的，我应该 allowed 你可以问问题了。我不知道是您是有问题呢，还是？
我有个问题，我刚才
现在
那个这样回答的时候，我没听清楚，就关于就是你在那 Common App 里，他问你的那个 race， 你是 Asian 呢还是 White 呀？他那个怎么说的？是要填，那个是 required 要填的，对吧？
你说是不是有个问题是他回答的，就是说你是不是identify 你自己是 Asian 还是不是？是这个问题吗？
对，他怎么回答的？我没听明白。
他回答是这样子，他说因为这个东西的话，就是说其实你的 last name 就 give it away， 就是说就基本上他们也能判断。但如果您说你的 last name 是一个类似于白人的一个姓的话呢，他的 recommendation 就是说你还是就是正常的该怎么回答就怎么回答，因为这个东西可能不一定会瞒得住。他是这么回答的，对，他不觉得非要就是说就是撒谎或怎么样，对。
或者隐瞒，那就说但是说后来他讲，就说关于父母的那个就是 background 的，就说哪个大学毕业学的什么，他那个是可以不填，如果不填的话没有影响。
那个他说的是比较 strategic 的，就是说，比方说，如果您孩子是申请的一个，比如说neuroscience， 就是说，但如果您的父母就是说也同样是相同一个专业的。他觉得这个东西的话呢，其实对小孩的这一个申请的话，不会有特别好的帮助，就不是说你们家全家都是学这个的小孩就更有机会能进这个学校，所以所以他那个的话，我其实不太记得那个问题他怎么回答的哈，但是我记得他是说的，就是说这个东西的话，不一定是就是说 very related to 这个 acceptance rate， 对。
好，谢谢。
你能听见我吗？
可以。
我就是因为我今天 join 晚了，真是不好意思。我就想问那个 recording 能不能1对1的 share 一下？我正好这样 miss 了。之前我 register 了，后来那个时间因为算错了，我就正好来的时候已经8点了，你正好结束了。
我知道你能加一下我的微信吧，但是这个我得问一下 John， 因为 John 他其实之前是给我讲的，他不想 share 这一个recording， 但是我可以再去 double check with 他一下。你能加一下我的微信吧。
就是那个小助手的那个回复那个微信是不是？
你可以加，我发在我这里哈，这里我加个我的吧，因为小助手有些时候忙的话，
对，
不一定知道那么多细节的东西。
是 Alison 好吧？后面那个。好的，那我加你的微信啊，谢谢你，谢谢。
行，大家是还有举手的，是还有问题吗？还是我需要？还是大家
你们这个机构是
可以听见我吗？
哦，行，行，谁先说啊？
我就想问一下，他现在提供这个服务是对12年级是不是有点晚？
您12年级是要ED 对吧？
对呀，是有点晚。
这个东西的话，
就是挺紧的。他现在还有这方面的那个，
是这样的，就是说，当然就是说，您可以填这个表，但是这个我需要对接给 John，因为看他的这个 capacity 哈，然后当然也看就是说，因为12年级的话呢，你的这个材料基本上已经都成型了。所以对他来说的话呢，他没有什么可拔高或者是可操作的空间了。但是呢 ，depends on 他有没有这个时间来做这个 case。对，然后或者是说，因为他其实有一个团队 ，John， 他有2个他的那一个就是说也是他的旗下的 consultant， 所以他们可能可以配合一起来做。但这个的话呢，需要他那边来决定。
那我就是把填完表，然后就等消息，是这意思吧？
行，对，因为填表的话，您会填你孩子的一个基本的信息，所以我这边会帮John来对接一下，因为John他不会说中文嘛，对，所以基本上我这边帮他就是说，把信息收集了，然后 forward 给他。
好的，行，谢谢哈。
你好 ，Alison， 可以听到吗？
可以啊。
你好，我想请教一下哈，就是第一个呢，就是关于 community service 这部分哈，因为现在有一个说法呢，就是这种藤校或者是 top 20、top 30的学校呢，一定要看你对这个 community 做的贡献哈。所以我想请教您的看法，这个东西到底有多大的重要性？有没有一些标化的东西？比如说你这4年要多少 hour， 有这些 rate 吗？
其实我不是升学的这个专家哈，所以我在这边回答你，我也怕是误导您。但是我是听过之前我们的一些嘉宾这个分享的一些讲座呢，它其实有些学校它其实是需要你满足一定的 community service 的 hour 的。我记得是这样，但是你说这个东西如果不满足了这个 hours， 对你升某一个大学有没有很大的影响？这个我觉得不是一个绝对的一个说法。但我知道，因为我们咖啡俱乐部之前也有很多的那一个提供给高中生的这个所谓的 volunteer service 嘛，他们很多人是说我们的学校是需要我们满足到 specific 的这个 hours 才行的，对。
对，是我知道，就是高中有一些高中是有这个要求的，你必须满足这个要求才能够毕业。但我现在不清楚的是大学有没有要求说，我这个大学收，我必须要求你有这些方面的 community service 要多少 hour， 我才能符合我入学的标准。这个是我不太清楚的。
我倒觉得这个东西可能每个学校是不同的，就说如果我觉得这是个硬性的规定的话，学校的网站上其实您应该是可以看得到的。但除非如果你说某个学校它有个所谓的潜规则哈，什么你这个 community service 必须要达到什么什么标准的话，但我觉得那个可能那我们外部也不太知道，但我没有觉得这是一个。比方说别人做10个小时，你做8个小时，那就会录取别人。我不觉得是这样的一个情况。希望我给你的建议有点用哈，但是我觉得还是自己再 double check 一下。
好，那接下来就是填了表以后是等着你们会回复是吗？大概多长时间之内会回复呢？
我尽量就是说，因为这个是相当于我现在一会儿要看一下我们填表的这个人数哈。当然就是说，如果填表的人里面有12年级的，我可能会先，因为这个比较急吧，可能我会先 forward 给John，然后我就比如说11年级、10年级这样再下来。对，对，但是我会要看一下今晚填表的人数。您是几年级？您还
9年级。
行，9年级 OK， 这个没问题。我可能会先处理一下12年级的人，但是我肯定争取在下周之内，我应该都可以 forward 给 John。然后呢 ，John 那边的话呢，如果是要 set up inquiry meeting 的话呢，他会有一个链接给你，然后你链接直接进去，你就选你available 的 time， 然后他就会，比如说你选半小时、1小时，然后你就可以直接在网上 book 了。
好的，明白了。请问这个 initial 这个 consultation 是 free 的还是收费的呢？
这个是 free 的。
好的，谢谢。
你能不能还再介绍一下你们这个机构到底是headquarter 在哪里啊？是怎么运作的？是一个叫华人咖啡俱乐部，还有一个你这个实际上是思慧教育。
对。
是2个是什么关系？
您是 Connie 是吧？ Connie 鱼。
对。
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 这 这样的，可能你刚刚进来的时候我们已经介绍过了，是这样的，华人咖啡俱乐部呢，我们两个机构都是位于纽约的，华人咖啡俱乐部呢，我们是2017年就成立了，所以它是一个非盈利的一个组织，然后呢是501C3的，其实就做的是一个华人的一个线上线下的这样的一个平台，然后通过各种的活动把大家给联系在一起，然后让这个华人就是说有一个资源相互交流的一个平台吧，然后呢，思慧国际呢，其实是我们去年8月份呢孵化出来的一个所谓的教育品牌。这个教育品牌呢，我们就是说现在专注的是提供一些那个 K12以及成人的课程。像我刚刚介绍的，我们的 K12和成人的这个投资和财商这一块是我们的这一个特色。因为我们的这一个 founder 的背景呢，还有我们的资源呢，大多数都是来自华尔街的，因为我们在纽约嘛。然后呢，同时呢，我们会做一些教育 related 的这样的一个webinar，这样子的话，就是说也是提供给我们的这样一个家长一些就是说可用的一些资源和这样的一个信息吧。对，所以现在这样的一个讲座呢，其实是我们平台上每周6都会进行的，但是每周6我们的这个话题呢会不太一样。像最近呢是升学季，所以我们就会请很多的这一个升学的嘉宾，来给我们分享。可能到11月份的话，我们就可能会分享其他的，比方说这个青少年的心理健康啊，然后亲子关系啊，还有一些其他的一些什么比如说私立高中的一些介绍什么的，对。
哦，好的，谢谢。因为我也来晚了，所以我前面没有听到，谢谢你。
也没听到，对。但是你可以加到，就是说你可以扫这个华人咖啡俱乐部的这个小助手2维码，然后你要想加到我们群里面，就大概看一下大家是在做些什么活动，您就扫码就可以，他就把你
对，我有在你们的 mailing list 上，每个星期都能收到你那个 email。
好的，行，谢谢你的这个支持哈，然后大家如果没有问题的话，我们今天就我们就结束了哈。如果还有问题的话呢，我还可以再开麦，因为我好像应该给大家开麦的这一个功能了。对，大家如果没有问题的话呢，那今晚我们就我看是还有人在举手吗？我看一下，大家好像是可以 unmute。你们应该都是可以 unmute 自己的，因为我给了权限。
能听到我吗？
可以啊。
对，我想问一下，你们那个思慧教育的网站是不是就是思慧教育.org，就是那个是这个网站是这个吗
？www. 我看一下 with wise 个
logo。OK，
我打一下哈。看到吗？然后有人在问这个 John 的收费和表在哪里哈？这个的话 ，John 的收费的话呢，其实是和 John 自己来聊的，因为他的这个 package 比较 customized， 所以我这边不太了解他的这个具体的这个收费哈。然后那个表的话 ，Brian 问的表，您现在如果看见屏幕上面的话呢，就有2个这个叫什么2个2维码。当然，如果您现在是在手机上来观看的话呢，可能你没法直接按来扫。但是如果你在我们的这个升学的这1、2、3、4、5群里面的话呢，一会儿这一个讲座结束之后，我会把这个表的 link 重新 share 在群里面，然后你也可以填得到。
您好，我想问一下，这样有没有 website？ 能不能看到它提供什么样的 package？
我看一下哈，它有 website， 但我得找一下哈，它的 website 我看一下，我要找一下，这个还真是，
这样可以省点时间，就可以看到它提供一些什么 package， 是不是适合我们的孩子？
它的 package 应该不会直接，它的价格应该不会直接放在上面哈。但我可以把这个给你分享一下，你可以看一下它的
内容。
对，刚刚问问题的是谁啊？刚刚就是问那个，是我看一下有几个人拿
Linda。
Linda 好的，行，那大家如果没问题的话，我就关掉了。就是说那个王楠哈 Jennifer 吴，然后大家没问题的话，那今天就祝大家这一个周末愉快了。好的，行，谢谢，那我就把它关掉了。 哎，刚刚是还有人在说话吗？好，没有了的话，那就感谢大家。如果有更多的问题的话呢，如果您在这个升学群里面的话呢，也可以直接在群里面问。对，或者我刚刚把我的那一个微信也分享在这个 chat box 里面了，然后大家可以加我的微信，如果想要私信我问一些问题的话，但因为这样他可能时间也比较紧嘛，所以如果是单独的1、2个问题的话呢，我可能没办法说每一个都传达给他哈，但是我们看一下，尽量能不能再邀请他再来做一次这个讲座。好的，还有人在举手，感谢大家哈，